Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of Tarot to the Nines, and today we're going to be looking at the number 2 in tarot, and to celebrate that I am wearing something that commemorates 2 of my most favourite characters in pop culture. And so I'm going to stand on my little box to show you. They are Calvin and Hobbes, except you can't actually tell that's Calvin because he's dressed up as a stormtrooper, and Hobbes has got his little Darth Vader helmet on there. But it's Calvin and Hobbes. I love Calvin and Hobbes. They are just so amazing. Anyway, not the philosophers, although they're great too. I'm just moving my plinth here so I don't trip over it. That would not be a good way to proceed with the video. So yeah, so today is all about the number 2 in tarot, and probably the first thing that is worth pointing out, and it's something that I know that some of you have spotted already. In fact, 𝙁𝙀𝙁𝙁, I hope I'm pronouncing your screen name correctly. 𝙁𝙀𝙁𝙁 made a very perceptive comment on, I think it was my last video, around the notion of the numbers in tarot, and the fact that when we were talking about number 1, the Magician, we were actually really talking about 2, because I talked about the concept of one and nothing, nothingness and somethingness being born simultaneously, because you can't have one without the other. One implies the other, so the moment one of those arises, including nothingness, the other one arises. So in a sense, the Fool and the Magician are born simultaneously, although we can also look at it as the Magician steps out of the Fool, because the Magician is the potential for manifestation being realised. But what 𝙁𝙀𝙁𝙁, you know who I mean, pointed out, is that actually when these concepts are born, the concept of 2 is born as well, because of course we've now got nothing and we've got something, which means that we've got 2 things, or one thing and one no thing, and that's 2. So absolutely, you're quite right. Duality is born the moment we have a concept of anything. And this is one of the things that you might call a cosmic joke, I suppose. And that is that the moment we talk about nothingness, we are actually talking about somethingness at the same time. And nothingness itself is a something. So behind all that, beyond all that, the place that the Fool is stepping out from is complete mystery. And trying to figure it out is a fool's errand, pardon the pun, because there's just no way of doing it. We are talking about an unfathomable mystery. It's what Alan Watts would say, would call trying to F the ineffable. You know, we are trying to F the ineffable if we're trying to figure out exactly how all these things fit together. Because in a sense, tarot is a bit like a hall of mirrors, all reflecting back on each other. I've described it before as a hologram or a many-faceted jewel, but hall of mirrors also works very well as an analogy, and in fact we'll come on to the concept of mirrors very, very shortly in this video. So yeah, it's a difficult thing to try and get all of this logically. So stay with me here and we'll just talk through where we are in tarot. So now we have the concept of 2 being born already, and it is embodied, of course, in the High Priestess, in the major arcana of the tarot. And we'll come on to the minors and the other cards that fit into this constellation shortly. But the High Priestess is the major card that embodies this notion of non-duality. So we have her sitting between her 2 pillars, dark and light, and we'll come on to that in a second as well. But the first thing I want to just say about this is, you know, how does this idea of oneness become 2ness? And it is through mirroring. So what happens is, we talked about the monad in the last video. This symbol here is the monad, this Greek concept for oneness. And what we have here is a symbol for the dyad, where we have 2ness. And what's happened, as you can see, is the monad has mirrored itself. It has just kind of flipped over and mirrored itself. So now effectively we have 2 monads, and that's what makes up a dyad. And in that we have then the capacity for, well, all the things that 2ness is about. Connection, joining, but also division. Because that's the inherent thing about 2ness and duality. It really is a double-edged sword in a sense, because not only can it's a problem actually. It's a problem in some religious traditions who, you know, in a lot of texts and in numerology, the number 2 can be considered kind of a problem, because it is the thing that represents our split from non-duality, from oneness with everything. And the moment you have two-ness, you have the potential for conflict, you have the potential for division. But of course you also have the potential for creation in the material world. And in fact, that is what one of the things that the High Priestess and the concept of two symbolises. It's that potential for creation, dynamic creation within the material world. So let me also just show you, here we have again, this is the Orbifold Tarot that I showed a couple of videos ago, and a couple of you have asked about it. So it's Orbifold Tarot. If I remember to do it, I'll link below so you can see exactly where the tarot comes from. But it's a great tarot if you're interested in numerology, or just in the development of if you like, primary ideas in the tarot. So we saw that it had a card for the void, it had a card for manifestation, both of which were prior to the card for nothingness, which is the Fool. And then you had the Magician, oh, wrong way, Magician, the single dot, if you like, monad, and then the High Priestess, which is that mirroring. And just something to note about the High Priestess card here, in relation to this concept of creation and things being born into the material world, is if you look in the middle there, what you see in that kind of middle section, the ellipse between the two circles, is what's called the Vesica Piscis. Pronounced differently by different people. I say Vesica Piscis, others would say Vesica Piscis, etc. But this is well, not to get too gynecological, but I think you can see what I mean. Here we have the Sacred Yoni. This is the aperture through which creation is birthed. So everything comes from the joining of these two and the capacity for birth that this creates. So that is what creation is about. That's where creation comes from. What we also see in two-ness is the birth of the line. So when you have a single dot, that dot can't go anywhere. But when you have two dots, they can be joined together. And there's different ways of looking at that line, because of course lines divide things as well as join them. So we could see this as a concept of two things being joined together, but we could also see it as being two things that are separated. So a line separates. There's lots of things in the news at the moment about the concept of building walls to keep others out. You know, I've talked to you in the last video about the concept of the other, and that's something else that is born in this world of duality. So we can't function in this world without duality, but it creates this situation where there is a them and us. There's a me and a you, and that can create separation, but of course it can also create the potential for joining and linking together. Now, another interesting little thing to say about two, and I'm wearing my 𝙇𝙀𝙎𝙊𝙐𝙍 pendant, which I got when I was in Sweden recently, and this is the rune 𝙇𝙀𝙎, the second rune, which of course is like the B. So I hope you can see that there. So there are two words beginning with B, which I think are quite apposite in this, and one is 𝙍𝙀𝙎 and the other is Bismillah. Now I'm looking at my notes to make sure I don't misspell these, and some of you already know what these are and where they come from. This word means in the beginning and comes from the Hebrew translation, or the Hebrew text of the Bible. And here we have Bismillah, which comes from the Quran, and that means in the name of God, and again is about the beginning of things, the creation of things. And look, notice, they both begin with the second letter of the alphabet, and the second letter of the runic alphabet, and in Hebrew it's Beth, so the second letter in Hebrew. So this second letter, this number 2, indicates the beginning of creation, the birth of creation, the world of things. Prior to that, we're in a world where things don't exist other than the one thing. And if there's only one thing, and there's no separation, then even the concept of thingness as we understand it doesn't really exist, because if you've only got one thing, one indivisible thing, without beginning, without end, without boundaries of space or time, then how can you differentiate? You can't. You can only differentiate when you get into the world of duality, and that's the world we're stepping into with the High Priestess. The other thing to say about duality, of course, and it's embodied very well in the symbol, the Tai Chi symbol, which encompasses the yin and the yang, the dark and the light, within each of which exists a seed of the other, and the symbol indicates that at some point the one turns into the other. So darkness grows and grows and grows and grows, but then at a certain point tips over and becomes light, which grows and grows and grows and grows, and then at a certain point tips over and becomes darkness. And it indicates in this dualistic world the cycles that go on, and we see it around us all the time, the cycle of life, the cycle of the world as it moves around the sun, the cycle of the seasons. But we see cycles everywhere else. We see cycles in the human body, we see cycles in terms of age, we see cycles in terms of politics, we see cycles in terms of religion, we see cycles everywhere. So again, intrinsic to the notion of duality, this dualistic world, is the notion of cyclical motion, of changing motion. And the 𝙇𝙄𝙉𝙆𝙊𝙐 tells us that from the one thing comes the two things, and from the two things comes the 10,000 things. So everything that can be created is created because we have got this ability through opposites and connected separate entities to move things forward. And of course, when we come on to the next card, the next number, 3, we see the fruits of that creation. We see the third thing being born. So, what else to tell you? Let's see what else I've got on my notes. Well, actually, I've got a couple of... Well, first of all, the other thing I'm going to show you when I show you these cards, and I only really spotted this before I came on, but the other thing that this, to me, looks like, this and this, and this and this looks like, is cell division. So if you think about a single cell dividing itself and then splitting into two, you can imagine these moving further apart and you'd end up with 2, and then those 2 splitting and dividing. And that's how life grows, that is how life develops. So on the symbolic, mystical, metaphysical, theological level, we can see that two-ness and the development of two-ness is what leads to everything else. But even in the physical world, even in the very fact-based material world, we can see that one thing can become 2 things, can become 10,000 things. So it applies, this concept applies all across the board. So 2 quotes for you, and the first one is from the American psychiatrist Karl Menninger, and he's here talking about the notion of 2. In the 2, we experience the very essence of number more intensely than in other numbers, that essence being to bind many together into one, to equate plurality and unity. Our mind divides the world into heaven and earth, day and night, light and darkness, right and left, man and woman, I and you. And the more strongly we sense the separation between these poles, whatever they may be, the more powerfully do we also sense their unity. And I think that's a really powerful quote, in that what it's indicating is that even in unity, even in the separation of unity, unity is inherent. It's a bit like a magnet with 2 poles that attract each other. You know, you can split those poles into 2 opposites, but actually they're not really opposite. They retain the memory of each other and they're attracted. So we never ultimately lose unity, but what we might lose is the awareness of it. And you could argue, and I would argue, that actually what the tarot, particularly in the way that it develops in terms of number, is a great representation of, is this notion that we as human beings lose sight of our unity with everything, and it's losing sight of the unity with everything that leads to all the, what you might say, interesting experiences of our lives, both good and bad. So obviously separation and disunity causes a great deal of conflict and pain and anxiety in our lives and in the world. But also separation can provide amazing opportunities for remembering connection. So that amazing feeling you get when you fall in love with someone, or the amazing feeling you have of being near your friends, or just being able as a separate entity to appreciate a beautiful sunset. You know, if you were that sunset, and on some level you are that sunset, but if you believed you were that sunset, if you didn't see any separation between you and the sunset, then you would miss the opportunity to enjoy the sunset. So duality, in a very real sense, is a double-edged sword, and it's important to remember that when the two cards, any card with the number 2 on it, comes up in tarot, and we'll come on to that in a second. So in this material world, we need duality to function. One chopstick cannot feed you. Two chopsticks, which can come together and pick food up, they can feed you. So we need that duality. We need that action and reaction, as Newton would say, in order to move things forward. So everything, all actions have an equal and opposite reaction. Duality. That's what makes the world go round. It takes two, baby. It takes two. So if we want to live in this world and we want to function in this world, we need to understand how to operate in this world of duality. But it's also worth bearing in mind that the tarot tells us, and the Tao tells us, and even nature tells us that really, although things appear to be separate and divided, they are of one substance. So I'll finish this section with another quote, and this is from the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, who said, "Oh, grant me my prayer, that I may never lose the touch of the one in the play of the many. That I may never lose the touch of the one in the play of the many." So perhaps behind the High Priestess's veil and between her pillars is a reminder, when we go back to that kind of primordial sea, we are stepping back into the oneness and the nothingness that the tarot embodies. So now, let's have a look at the cards. Okay, so again, I don't want to do too much work here and deprive you of the opportunity to explore these numbers for yourself in relation to tarot and in relation to the deck that you are most used to working with. And I've been using my giant rider weight to illustrate the meanings and my interpretations of the card, but this principle of looking at number in relation to tarot will work with any deck, whether it's got illustrated minors or unillustrated minors. So I would encourage you to explore all of this from the perspective of your own system and the deck that you're used to working with. And I'd also encourage you to make sure that when you're working with a deck, it can be great to respect and is great to respect the system that is inherent in that deck, but I would also encourage you to not lose sight of your own responses to the cards. And one of the books that I recommend that people have a look at, and that is actually one of the things that is the book that originated the common usage of the concept of constellations of cards, is this book by 𝙇𝙄𝙉𝙆𝙎, the Tarot Handbook. And this book is an interesting book. I will say that when I first got this book, I was kind of new to tarot, and I wasn't very familiar with the TWOS deck, which is the deck that is used, not just used to illustrate this book, but is the deck that 𝙇𝙄𝙉𝙆𝙎 used to stimulate her thinking about tarot. And at the time I was trying to learn the TWOS deck. Now, the thing is, she does not follow the TWOS system, so she does not take Aleister Crowley's approach to the cards. What she does instead is she works on responding to the images in the card, Lady Frida Harris's images, on the basis of her understanding, or 𝙇𝙄𝙉𝙆's understanding. And 𝙇𝙄𝙉 was an anthropologist who specialised in working with cross-cultural myths and symbols. So what she saw in these cards is certain symbols and motifs and repeated images that stimulated her thinking and reminded her of myths across the ages. And that's the thing about any kind of symbolic system. When it steps out of the ownership of the creator, if you like, and it's out there in the world, then it invites all kinds of responses. So I would encourage you, if you're interested in following a system, follow that system and, you know, go into it deeply, but don't assume that the system is everything, because it's not. You know, there's an opportunity for you to respond to the images in your way, and that's one of the things that's most powerful, I think, about taking time over these cards and looking at them in the context of number as you understand it, and allowing yourself to respond in your way to the images that you see and the meanings that you see. So with that said, I have just popped up onto the whiteboard a few keywords for these cards. And the constellation of the High Priestess, I should say, is, of course, the High Priestess. Remember, it all reduces down to 2. So the High Priestess itself, which is the 2, the 2s in the minor arcana, Judgement, which is 20, 2 plus 0 equals 2, and then in the Rider-Waite-Smith system, Justice is the 11th card, but of course in some systems, Strength is the 11th card. In this one, it's 8. So here is my take on that. If you are following this and using the Rider-Waite-Smith system, I would not recommend that you tie yourself in not wondering, is it Strength, is it Justice? In the Rider-Waite-Smith system, 11 is Justice. That is just the way that it is. So I would encourage you to look at that first. If you are an 11, if any of your cards come out as 11, then look at Justice, and even if you don't like the Justice card, I would encourage you and invite you not to just go, well, actually I'd prefer it to be Strength. I'd invite you instead to sit with the Justice card and go into it deeply and see what you can learn from Justice being one of your numbers. That's the first thing to say. And if you're using a system or a deck where the 11th card, i.e. reducing to 2, the 11th card is Strength, go with Strength. That's what you should go with. Having said that, there is no doubt that in tarot, these 2 cards are the cards that are commonly transposed depending on the system you're using and depending on the deck that you're using. So I kind of see them as inhabiting the same space. And in my head, and I'm sure in many of your heads, I have this kind of virtual tarot deck, which is based on all of the things I've learned about tarots. Now, I respect that there are systems, and I think sometimes, and often, it's important to stick with the systems. But I'm not such a purist that I think I have to be rigid about that. So I am quite happy to think about Justice and Strength inhabiting that same space. And so I will always go with exploring the card in the deck that I'm working with first, but then thinking, well, is there something in there for me? So if you come out as an 11 and you're using the Rider-Waite-Smith system, I would say to you, think about Justice first and then have a look at Strength. Now, let's just stick with these while we're here, because we can go into the others in a second. In terms of 2-ness and duality, obviously Justice is very much about balance. It's about you know, weighing things up. It's about adjustment. It's about discernment. It's about the reckoning and rightness of things, and making a decision based on what we feel and what we believe to be just. There's all kinds of things that sit with Justice. But there's a duality in Strength as well, of course, because here what we're seeing is the 2 sides, or 2 of the sides of human nature, that kind of animalistic side, and then the more cultured, humanistic, one might say, or even divine side, and how they can be balanced. So the principle of 2-ness holds true for both Justice and for Strength. So I've already spoken a bit about the High Priestess in relation to being about intuition, about being the balance of dark and light, being about the emergence of duality into the tarot. Again, there's an element there of discernment, the idea of what is it that we're trying to learn, what's hidden, what's not hidden, what's available to us, what do we need to figure out for ourselves. And in Judgement, for me, this is one of the strangest cards in the deck, and in some ways is one of the most difficult. You know, it's a very powerful image, this notion of the very biblical image of the angel on high blowing the trumpet and the dead rising, Judgment Day. But for me, Judgment is also about our own judgments, the judgments we make. And in this dualistic world, we make judgments all the time. We have opinions all the time. We see certain things as right, certain things as wrong. That's just the nature of duality. So this card for me reminds me of the need to be thinking about how am I looking at the world, and do I trust my judgments, and am I challenging my own judgments? Am I making assumptions about things, or am I taking time to ask myself, is there a deeper truth? Is there a larger perspective, a higher perspective that I could be taking on the issues of my life? In relation to the minors, the way that the tarot constellation system works is that the minors represent opportunities and challenges. And I would say that all of the minors here, in fact all the twos in tarot, really are about relationship and choice. And of course they relate to the nature of their suit. So in the swords, which is the airy, mind-based suit, one might say that what we have here is something around balance of the mind, going very deeply into oneself, blindfolded so that the external world, that other, is not impinging on the senses, so that the person is in themselves, holding these two swords in a way that required a huge amount of strength. If that was recreated with a real person, with swords as the weight swords, real swords would be of that size, it's highly unlikely that somebody would be able to hold them like that without being incredibly fatigued, especially with, a blindfold on. So there's something there about almost a supernatural balance and an interiority, a relationship with the self, one might say. In relation to wands, where we're talking about the fiery, motivational side and the way that we interact in the world and the way that we bring our creative talents out, what I think of here when I see this card is something about custody, being a custodian of things and looking out over one's domain, holding the world in the palm of one's hand and making a choice about what that means and what level of responsibility one is going to take with this other. There is us and there is the world around us. So what do we see ourselves as being responsible for in terms of our relationship with the world? Bearing in mind that it might appear that there are two, there is us and that, but there is in fact only one. Thou art that. Let's go to cups. So cups, perhaps one of the more obvious images here. The two people, toasting each other with these massive cups. Those are big goblets of wine. Look at the size of those. They are going to have a great party after they've had that wine. Love, relationship, choice, negotiation, understanding others, balancing different viewpoints, discussing, something greater emerging. So, there being something that is greater than the sum of the parts. So when two people come together, there's never just two people when two people come together, because in their interaction, and I don't mean just in the physical sense of if two people interact sexually, then they can give birth to another human, although that applies as well. But just in the notion of there being a me and there being a you, and there being the relationship between us, as symbolised there. And then finally, Pentacles, the earthy suit, the practical suit, the get down into the dirt and see what's really happening suit. And here we might say that there's change, constant flow, constant balance. We have the character dancing around on this very flat surface, so movement on stillness. And then in the background we have these ships which don't have motion of their own, but are being buffeted and moved and shifted around on the sea. So there's being something there about change. So all kinds of different types of two-ness and duality are inherent in the Tarot Twos. And by now you know the drill. So my homework for you this time is to get your cards out, get your twos out, sit with them and work out what two-ness in tarot means to you. And once you've done that, please let me have your comments below, and I'll look forward to speaking to you again very soon when we move on to the result of two-ness. Number 3. Take care everyone. Bye.